Oh, wonderful to have you. Thank you for making time for this interview.
Likewise, thank you for having me.
Yeah. Well, as thank you for our audience for watching. And as you know, one of the reasons we have Ozan on the interview today is because of his new book. I actually have the English copy called Awaken Your Genius, and I see a lot of copies behind Ozan on his bookshelf there. But this is actually his second book. His first book is a national bestseller in the US, and it's called Think Like a Rocket Scientist. And then the reason Ozan is qualified to write that book is because he was a rocket scientist. But even more fascinating, other than the rocket scientist identity, which is already, very fancy, Ozan has a very interesting story of his own, how he grew up actually from Turkey and came to the States after high school, if I recall correctly, right? And I remember hearing Ozan in one of his interviews saying that he started to learn English at age of 11, which I think is very similar to a lot of our Chinese audience listening, as I started learning English when I was 13, because that's our time is when you're in middle school. That's when you are exposed to English. So that's why I think probably, although Ozan looks very different from Chinese, but his experience probably echoes with many of us who are listening to this. So my first question is actually for Ozan to give us a brief sort of snapshot of his life journey so far, so that you know who you are listening to. Please.
Sure. So I grew up in Istanbul, Turkey, and growing up, we lived in this small apartment and didn't have reliable access to electricity, so power would go out all the time. And as a little boy, that would terrify me. And my dad, to entertain me and distract me, came up with a game. He would light a bunch of candles, he would grab my soccer ball, and then he would rotate the soccer ball around one of the candles to show me how the Earth rotated around the sun. And those were my first astronomy lessons, and I was hooked. And in middle school, when I was starting middle school, my moonshot was to become an astronaut one day. And I remember going to the middle school library to research the background of every single astronaut that had ever worked at NASA. And my goal was to identify exactly what they did to get to where they were so I could create this roadmap for myself. And so I learned English as a second language. I researched how to get into colleges in the United States. And I ended up coming here when I was 17 to study astrophysics at Cornell. And while there, I worked on the operations team for the 2003 Mars Exploration Rovers mission. So we sent two rovers called Spirit and Opportunity to Mars in 2003. And the mission ended up being really, really successful. We had designed the rovers to last for 90 days, but one of the two, Opportunity, ended up roving the red planet for over 14 years into its 90-day lifetime. So it was a really cool experience being a part of that. But then, and this has been a theme across my life, is I'll do something for a little while, and once I've gotten enough out of it, I will quit and go do something else. So for rocket science, for me, I did that throughout college, worked on this Mars mission, but then I sort of stopped learning and growing. And I didn't have an interest in going and getting a PhD in astrophysics, which would have been sort of the next step to do. And instead, I became more interested in the physics of society. So how society is structured, how society works, and ended up taking this law class when I was still in university, which I really enjoyed. And law school in the United States is a graduate program. So you do your undergraduate first in whatever subject you want. So mine was astrophysics. And then after that, you can go to law school. So I actually ended up going to law school and became a lawyer, did that for 2-3 years. And then in 2010, I made the switch into academia and became a law professor. I got tenure in 2016 as a law professor, and then I started to get bored again. And that was my most recent, probably most significant transition, because once you get tenure in the United States, professors don't leave their jobs, because tenure means you've got a job for life. You've got a steady paycheck for life. It's really a, recession-proof, economy-proof, everything-proof career. So once you get tenure, and this was my thought too, my assumption going into academia, I thought I'd be a law professor for the rest of my life because I loved to teach, until one day I didn't love it anymore. So I left that, and now I write books and I give keynotes, and I have an email list. And so it's more about teaching to different audiences, to non-academic audiences, and creating things that didn't exist before.
Yeah. Thank you. It's amazing journey because I think about it. I think when you helped or participated in that rover launch effort, you're basically an undergrad who were fresh to the US,
Yeah.
right? If you think
Yes.
about
Yeah.
it. Yeah, and then after that studying law Ozan was when he was talking about he was teaching Lewis and Clark, which is a very top law school. So it's actually very difficult to get in, and he nonetheless got tenured. So if you think about it, it's like definitely a high achiever story, right? So every step you've made seems to be unattainable, and especially as a foreigner. And I assume back you, because I shared in my book that when I came to the States for the first month, I don't understand what people are saying, although I thought I understand English. Did you have a similar experience?
For sure, yeah, because the way, as you know, the way you learn English as a second language, what you read in a book, in a textbook, is so different from the way that people speak. So my first month at Cornell was like, oh my God, I don't know what's going on. I don't know all of these like slang words that people are using, these informal expressions. You just don't learn in high school. At least I didn't. And so yeah, the first couple of months was very interesting.
Yeah. Well, thank you and I share exactly the same. I remember when I first came to the States, I actually scored very high on my English test when I was in China. When I came, I was like, what language are they speaking? It really literally took me like a month to understand, to sit in the lecture hall and understand what they're saying. And then, as you said, even slangs. I remember when I was in grad school, they came in and said something like, I said, thank you. They said, you bet. I was like, bet what?
We're gambling now? What's going
know,
on?
like I know that's a gambling word. Like, bet what? Well, but that aside, so it's an amazing journey you've gone through, right? So I want to kind of, put his experience in context for our audience. To think about it, this is a 17-year-old boy who grew up in Istanbul, came to the States for the first time. And first of all, we'll probably get to it later. I think it was connected to his book. First of all, how magically he got himself into this March Rover launch program as an undergrad and a foreigner nonetheless who speak broken English, at least half broken. I know for sure, because that's kind of how my English was. And then he decided to go to law school, and law school is very competitive to get in, and then you actually require a high command of the English language. So it's actually very challenging even for a native speaker. So for a foreigner to get in, and nonetheless, then after he graduated, after he worked here for a couple of years, he got to one of the top, college, or I think it's a college, but it's a very elite college, Lewis and Clark. And after that, it made tenure. So I think people can easily say, hey, this is a success story. And then of course, then you left that job, right? So like many people probably put their lifetime goal as getting to where you are. And I think you're probably only around 40 something, or maybe younger than that when you left the job.
Yeah, I just turned 42. Yep.
Oh yeah. And then started, basically become a self-employed person, right? And then writing and speaking. So there must be a lot of struggle, because I go through the same process, because it is something you've achieved, in common people's eyes, is something that's easy to give up or easy to not continue. And then I'm sure that change, every time the change, we can talk about lightly and laugh about it. There is very profound inner work you have done. And I think that inner work is basically what's in this book. And tell us a bit, like, if you look back your journey since, let's say, when you were 17, maybe even younger, until when you're like up to this point. What is the major inner breakthrough you believe that helped you in this transition? Or if you can share one example or time where you struggled the most, I think that will be very enlightening to our audience.
Sure. Yeah, I'll actually take you back to the day that I realized that I no longer wanted to be a law professor. And so I taught constitutional law and criminal law, and I remember stepping up to the podium. The class was just beginning to teach constitutional law, which again was my dream. When I was a law student, I loved constitutional law, and then became a law professor. And constitutional law jobs are particularly hard to get. And so the fact that I got it and I was teaching constitutional law was like this dream come true. And I loved it. Until, and this was, I think in 2016 or 2017, I stepped up to the podium to teach the class. And right before class began, I felt my whole chest sink with this feeling of not again. Like, I can't believe I'm about to teach the same class, the way I've taught it now for dozens of times again, to the same, very similar students. Students change, but most of the content of the course is the same. The questions that come from the students are the same. So it was just same. And there was this bodily feeling of, this is no longer right for you. At first I ignored it. I actually suppressed it, because my plan was, my 10-year plan, 20-year plan was to just stay being a law professor and maybe move to a different law school at some point, but keep in that profession for sure. And so my rational mind was telling me, no, you got to stick to the plan. The plan was, you got to be a law professor. You got tenure. You're at the brink. You're at the top of where you could come in this profession, and certainly a long way to go too. But this bodily sensation kept presenting itself, this like inner knowing from my gut that this is no longer right for me. And when I looked deeper and I asked myself, and this is where the inner work you mentioned comes into play too, of like, what's going on? Why am I no longer enjoying this? Why is this thing that I once loved no longer suitable for me? And the answer was clear, because I'd stopped learning. I stopped growing. It was, attending the same committee meetings, writing the same types of academic articles. I had also gotten tired of, when you're an academic, you're speaking to a very specialized subgroup of academics in your field, and the real world is like ignoring what you're saying, basically. And so, and I had gotten tired of that, and I had said everything I wanted to say in terms of academia. And so I was like, all right, I think there's something here, so I'm going to start looking elsewhere. And so I thought about what I want to do. And one of the things that came up very strongly was that I wanted to write books for non-academic audiences, so for general audiences. And so I ended up starting writing online. So I started a blog back in 2016 and a podcast, and just started writing online about whatever was interesting to me. And I have to say, it was really hard. And one of the hardest things, I think, in making these transitions is, I was at the top of my field in constitutional law. And then the next day, when I'm starting this new thing, I'm a nobody. So
yeah.
all of that credibility you built up, all of that expertise you built up, I had professor in front of my name for 10 years. All of a sudden, all of that is gone, and you're starting over from scratch. And that can be really hard to do. And there's also a lot of freedom in that, I have to say, because it's this liberating thing of like, okay, I'm going to let go of the past, and now I get to write on a blank slate, and that blank slate can contain whatever it is that I want. But it's also really humbling, because you just let go of what made you successful in the past and the credibility that came with that, and all of a sudden you're starting over from scratch.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing. There are a few gems in what you said. I mean, it's full of gems, but there are a few things that's really touching. One is what you shared about feeling the sensation in your body, and having that feeling in the chest. I think usually for people who have big brains, and I think you're one, and I consider myself as one as well, we tend to ignore that.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, oh, I just sleep. I'll just rest a bit. It will be fine. We kind of ignore the signal our body is sending us. And then the fact that you actually caught it and didn't let it go, and sat on it, and sort of followed that thread almost, to say, what is this trying to tell me? I think that's quite profound. I think your book mentioned that as well. Like, sometimes our big ideas or concepts kind of become this shield that shield us from seeing what's really going on, what's the truth. I think that's really moving. And then the second thing you talked about is this whole becoming nobody, which is, I echo so much with it, because well, let's say before you become nobody, the fact that you feel confined. I used to write in my blog as well. I said why I left academia was I felt that I know too much about too little. I know a lot, but that's that's probably less than 100 people in the world that appreciate what you do. And of course, you can continue to get money and get grants if you want, but that's that's it. Like you feel like a lack of connection with, well, for me, or deep down, if it's a positive thing, is this immense sense of curiosity, right? Like what's going on outside of my field, which, yeah, we have this title on. And then the third one you mentioned is this piece about becoming nobody, which is true. I remember when I left McKinsey, because in McKinsey I was, sort of one of the youngest partners. I have 3 kids. I'm a Asian woman in California. Think about it, right? So everything kind of worked out well for me. but I was like, wow, so like if this is the life, for a year or two, it's exciting. But then to extend, things seems to be different. But when I actually left to take the job as for Gates Foundation, which is a philanthropy organization, and my biggest feedback is that this is a career killing move.
Yeah.
Right. So it's very similar. Thank you for sharing that. And then, but in a way, in Buddhism, they have this whole concept of detachment. Or detachment. Like, so identity is good. We actually all need some kind of identity, right? It gives us validation. It gives us sort of a sense of security. But it also becomes this big attachment where it seems like we cannot be anything without those labels.
Yeah.
So you definitely went through this sort of detachment process very profoundly. Multiple times. Yeah. So tell us how you feel about this process. I think that's kind of what's covered in this book as well. And like you started with death, right? And then you talk to, and those are very big words that people say, well, but I think when metaphorically that is every detachment is a death and rebirth, right? Yeah. Share with us how you think about this whole process of death and birth, and why you start your book with those 2 words.
Yeah, I think death is a very profound one and a resonant one, because I think steps forward in life require steps down from what you built in the past. So you have to die metaphorically before you die multiple times. You're experiencing these ego deaths, these identity deaths. The attachment that I tied to, for example, being a professor. Yeah, my identity was so tightly wrapped around that career. And there was a professor in front of mine, people called me Professor Varol. And so letting go of that is really a process of death. And I think there's grief there too, of like, oh, wow, this thing that I once loved, I no longer love. And there's a period, I think, which you can't skip over, of looking back and grieving for what once was, and then looking to the future. And one of the things that helped me was realizing, an economist call these sunk costs, like the time and money and resources you spent to go get a PhD in microbiology, for example, right? That might be called a sunk cost, as in you wasted your time. Now you're going to do something else. But I don't see it as a waste. I see it as a gift. It's a gift from your former self to your current self. Because you can take what you learned in microbiology, I can take what I learned in astrophysics or as a law professor, and I can apply it to something else. And that's what I do on a daily basis. So one of the things that helped me of letting go of that ego or that identity and letting it die was actually seeing what that career gave me as a gift. And it taught me so many things. Like, for example, I taught these big required first-year classes filled with students who honestly did not want to be in the room, because they were not interested in constitutional law. They were in the class because it was required. And I had to somehow engage them. I had to get them interested in the material. So I would bring in all of these stories, these interesting stories from constitutional law, from the judges who wrote the opinions, or about the cases themselves, to make the material inherently more interesting. So I taught myself how to become a good storyteller by necessity. And now I could take that skill and I could apply it to the books I'm writing. In Awaken Your Genius, there's so many interesting stories that I've come across, and then I repackage them. I infuse it with my own storytelling skills that I picked up in academia to create these captivating stories that tend to last, because humans are storytelling creatures. Everyone loves a good story. And so it's almost like a Trojan horse. I embed the principle into the story to convey it to the audience. And that's a skill that I learned as a law professor. And so that was also really helpful of looking back. And I encourage anyone who's listening in to do this as well. Look back on your life and and think about what you learned in your prior career that you could take then to apply to whatever it is that you're building next.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think what you did is really this concept of reframing, right? Instead of framing it as a loss or as a departure, you're framing it as this is, it is a learning ground. I've learned a lot of things from it, although I've lost the title or the position. But there isn't any loss other than that. Everything else is still yours. And not only yours, it's something you can use as an asset to apply to whatever you're doing next. Yeah.
Exactly.
Right. And then you talk about this 第一章叫做死亡，第二章叫做重生. So the first chapter is on part 1 is death, and the second part is birth. And then the third one come naturally to the inner journey. Because like when you talk about there's many deaths, I think for people who are familiar with my live streams, I talk about Hero with 1,000 Faces, or The Hero's Journey by Joseph Campbell, and talk about exactly that's how we go through. So that when I was reading your book, I was like almost revisiting that hero story as well. So how do you link this? How do you go from a loss, right? So a departure or a step down to birth. So how does the journey look like for you? Because you've been actually traveling on this journey multiple times, right? So from leaving Turkey, coming to the States, or from then becoming this astrophysicist, and then going to law school and becoming a professor, and now again, at least a few visible ones. I'm sure there are invisible ones too. Like now, if you look back this multiple times you've traveled on this journey, what is this journey like? If I'm a commoner, because in my eyes, you're like for most of the audience, okay, this you've achieved so much. Like, is there something I can learn that can help me with this journey too? What are the few steps you would take that I can learn and then take it in my own life as well?
Yeah, I think I talk about a number of things you can do in the inner journey part. I'll just mention one of them here that popped to mind immediately, which really has been a North Star for me throughout my entire life, which is curiosity. So following your curiosity, I think there is this popular phrase or popular saying like follow your passion, which you hear a lot in commencement speeches. I think for me, that doesn't work because passion is something that's really hard to figure out. When someone asks me what my passion is, I have a really difficult time answering that question. But when someone asks me, what are you curious about? That's much easier for me to answer because I think curiosity is inherent to human beings. I mean, if you look at a baby or a child interact with the world, they're constantly driven by curiosity about what others are doing, their toys, the world around them. They're looking at it with this amazement and wonder. And then their moves are dictated solely by curiosity. And I think we lose touch with curiosity, unfortunately, largely because of the way that the education system is structured. And certainly that was the case where I grew up in Turkey. Curiosity was replaced by conformity. And instead of questions, we got answers. And your only job was to just memorize these answers that were determined by people far smarter than you were, and then spit them back out on a standardized test. That was the entire education system. And unfortunately, there was no room for me to say, hey, I want to learn more about this. I'm really curious about astrophysics or whatever it might be. I want to learn that. No room for that. There's no room for even, you mentioned reframing. There's no room for reframing in the education system either. You're handed a problem by the teacher and you're supposed to just solve the problem versus asking, is there a better problem to solve? Can I reframe this problem to address it differently? And by the way, these are exactly the skills that you need to thrive as an adult in society, because when you go out into the workforce, problems aren't handed to you. Normally, if you really want to thrive, you have to go find problems yourself. And then you have to reframe them. You have to change them. You have to ask yourself, is there a better problem to solve here? But none of that is taught in school. And actually worse, a lot of that inherent curiosity, unfortunately, is cured. It's robbed out of students. And so it's been a lifelong journey for me to get back in touch with that curiosity and ask myself. So I alluded to this earlier. What got me into law school was just curiosity about how the legal system is structured. How do humans behave and how do they organize themselves around rules? And that curiosity led me to take one class in senior year of university. And I loved it so much. I ended up going to law school. And same thing after I left my tenured position as a professor. I didn't, I was sort of placing these little, you mentioned you bet, placing these little bets on the side to see, okay, these are the types of things that I'm curious about. I was curious about coaching other people because it's like a natural extension of teaching. I was certainly curious about writing online, and I was curious about having a podcast. So I started placing these little bets on the side when I was still a law professor, just following my curiosity. I'm curious about this, and I'm curious about this, and I'm curious about this. And then seeing what actually came of them, what I actually enjoyed doing. Because it's one thing to hypothetically say to yourself, oh, I'm really curious about, for example, having a podcast, but it's something else to actually do it. And you don't know, it's hard to tell if you're going to enjoy it or not unless you try. So a lot of my life I view as a series of, I'm curious about this, and now I'm going to experiment with it. I'm going to place a little bet. So I'm going to start a podcast and commit myself to recording 10 episodes just to see if I like it and just to see if an audience starts to develop around my ideas. And so of the little bets I placed, writing online was one that was really, I was thriving. I was really enjoying it. And then an audience started to form that got bigger over time. And then that eventually ended up culminating in a publishing deal for my first book, Think Like a Rocket Scientist. But I think that's the inner journey, really. It for me, it always begins with curiosity. I tend to think of like these internal nudges of curiosity as breadcrumbs that are left on a path for you, and you're just following them, not knowing where they're going to go.
Yeah, beautifully said. And I think, like later in the in our interview, I'll go to education and go to your father's role, and because you mentioned him multiple times. I think your previous interviews, I think he, in that environment really played a role in keeping that or igniting that that light. And but I want to go back to one question, is that I guess people would agree, saying that's great. Yeah, everybody has curiosity, have this sense of wonder. But I think most people were held back, not because they don't have curiosity, but because they are afraid of failing. Okay. So let's say I'm curious, as you said, okay, about my blog. Oh, but what if I wrote a blog and nobody reads, right? Or, I'm curious about this, like going to law school. What if I fail? Like, I think that's the common thinking behind many people's mind. Yeah. So I think it's the fear that hold them back. Let's not try, because like people could easily calculate, like if you were a common person's logic, people would make a calculated decision, right? They would say, hey, you already got an astrophysicist, thing, and you got involved in this bright project, then go to work for NASA. Your chance of success is so much higher compared to you start anew as a foreigner to go to law school. So I think it's this story or this calculation of chance of success that commonly stop people from continuing. How do you deal with it? Like, I'm sure you're smart. Like, I'm sure you can do the calculation as well as anybody else. But how do you overcome that sense of, what if I fail?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a hard one. And I'll mention a few ideas here. So number one, you can succeed at something you don't like, or you no longer like, or you can fail at something you actually enjoyed or you were curious about. And I'm going to talk about what failing means in just a moment too. But I really do think that's the start point for me. For me, succeeding at something that I no longer like is in and of itself a failure. It's a failure to honor my own voice. It's a failure to honor my own desires. It's a failure to honor my curiosity. It's really a betrayal of the self for me. And so if I had stuck being a law professor on paper, I still would have been successful, but internally I would have been very unhappy. And so I would not consider that a success. So that's the starting point. I think for me, success is what is coming up for me right now? What am I curious about? What signals is my body sending to me? Like that, the chest sinking. And actually listening to those voices and honoring them versus suppressing them. And as you said, this is really hard to do, particularly for intellectual people. And this was true for me my whole life. I operated primarily with my brain, ignored my body. I thought my body's only function was to feed my brain and just like to be this vessel to walk my brain around. And I no longer think that. And the more I listen to my body, the better my life gets. So that's number one. Number two, this fear of failure. And I'll mention two things here. There's more in the book about this, but number one is, for me, there is a price you pay for failing to try at all. And then there's a price you pay for failing. So the price you pay for trying something and failing at it, I think that's the ticket price for admission to a courageous life. And I'm happy to pay it, and I paid it so many times. There is a different type of price you pay, and that's the price for failing to try at all. I've paid that price before, and I never want to pay it again. Because the regret that comes from, man, I was really curious about this, and I never explored it. Like if you're on your deathbed and you're looking on your life, like, I wish I had gone to law school, or I wish I had taken this class, or I wish I had started a podcast. That regret, to me, registers so acutely, and the pain of that is so high when I actually let myself feel it, that it becomes easier for me to say, you know what, I am going to try this. Mm-hmm. I'm going to honor that, and I don't want to regret this. I don't want to regret the pain that comes from suppressing this desire, suppressing this curiosity, and instead of suppressing it, I'm going to honor it. And yeah, and by the way, failure, it's going to happen. I've failed so many times in my life. And it's a real fear, by the way, right? As you said, you could start a blog and no one might read it. That's a real fear. You might start a podcast and only your parents might listen to it. Those are all very real possibilities. So then how do you move forward anyway? And I already mentioned one of this. I think there's an inherent benefit that comes from saying, hey, I was curious about this. I honor that curiosity. I tried it. That in and of itself is a win for me. But number two is I've never had a failure that didn't lead to some significant learning. And so to me, failure is never failure if I view it as a learning opportunity. So if I can look back at whatever it was that I failed at and say, you know what, yeah, like the result wasn't what I hoped for, but I learned, for example, let's say you started a podcast and it didn't work out. I learned how to interview people. I learned how to do background research on my guests. I met some really interesting people. You know, I interviewed 15 people on my podcast. I made friends with some of them, and those friendships are going to last. You know, I figured out how to do podcast production or editing or whatever it might be. I think if you look back at whatever it is you failed at and view and actually write down what you learn from it, that really personally takes the sting out of failure for me, because now all of that wasn't a waste. It was actually just a learning opportunity. And you can take what you learned and apply it to whatever it is you're going to do next.
Yeah, beautifully said. I think for the, as you mentioned, it's what is the real failure, right? So if we are afraid of failure, how do we define failure? So failure, as I think you said it very profoundly, is like not trying something I wanted to try is probably the greatest failure, because that's, you know, life is only one time and we're here for, you know, 70, 80 years. And that's it, right? So like it's a pretty
at best, by the way, right? Tomorrow isn't guaranteed. Yeah,
exactly. And then, but I think the difficulty, the reason I ask those questions are the question I receive a lot, and people would say, "Hey, you have the courage to do that because, you know, for example, if you can go to the US, it means your family has some financial resources, right? So like people say, hey, I don't have that. Okay, so like, of course, you'll have the luxury of trying that because, you know, your parents are healthy and I don't have that. So there are many times you would hear people say, hey, yes, great, you can do that. But there are things I can't. I feel constrained in doing that. And then that's one thing, one challenge. The other challenge I often receive is that people would, I think you probably would have, you know, connection with that statement, is that in the conformist society, the type of failure, like sort of the commonly recognized type of failure, meaning you lose a good job or you lose a good title, is there's much more value placed on that type of failure, right? Because you will hear from your relatives, you will hear from your classmates, you will feel like all the society seem to have that voice. I think the US is frankly is already much better. Of course, it's still there, but compared to like I'm sure the culture in Istanbul or the culture in in East Asia, sort of the external voice seems to be much stronger. And they would say, and sometimes they would make this comment, oh, of course, even if you're American, you can do that. You're not. So there are things like that, right? So like, how do you as an individual deal with those? Like, of course, one, people would say, hey, you have certain privilege, maybe not a huge privilege. I mean, you're probably not somebody who from a high, like inherit whatever huge amount of money, or but at least you're better than others. Okay, that's one. And second is that, hey, yes, you're in America, fine, you can say that. We're here, we're different. Like, especially for our audience, like, we're in China, we can't do that. Okay, then what, if I pose this challenge to you, what would be your answer?
Yeah, great question. So I think it's one thing in life, by the way, absolutely comes with limitations. There's so many types of limitations that so many people face. I think it's one thing to acknowledge those limitations, and then it's something else to surrender to them and say, because of this limitation, I can't do that. And there have been times in my life where I think those voices echoed really, really strongly. I am in the United States now, but there was a time when I wasn't. I was in Turkey. I'm now financially secure, but I grew up in very, very humble economic circumstances. And so there was a time when I wasn't that. But those voices still come. I remember this moment, which I talk about in Awaken Your Genius. I had just gotten into Cornell, and I was still in Istanbul. I'm a high school senior. And I decided to research what the astronomy department at Cornell was up to. And I found out that one of the professors at Cornell was in charge of this Mars mission. He was a principal investigator. He used to be a graduate student for Carl Sagan, who was one of my heroes growing up too. So this was like too good to be true. There's no job listing, nothing. But I saw that, I saw his email address. I saw that he's in charge of this Mars mission. So I wrote him an email. I sat down in front of my computer. I'm still in Istanbul. And I just expressed my burning desire to work for him in any capacity. And I attached my resume, and just when I thought about clicking send on the email, this chorus of voices filled my head, and they sounded very similar to the types of voices you just described. Like, there is no job posting. Why would you apply for a job that doesn't exist? You were born in a developing country to very humble economic circumstances. You can't do that, right? Other people get to work on space missions, not you. Or, you're a skinny kid with a funny name from a country halfway around the world. Like, what could you possibly, as a 17-year-old, contribute to this Mars mission? And I almost didn't hit send on the email. But then I remember collecting myself, took a moment and asked myself, like, where are these voices coming from? Are these voices actually truly my own beliefs? Or are they other people's voices? And when I thought about it, it was really clear that these were voices that I picked up from teachers, from students, from this conformist society at large. None of them were aligned. And then I asked myself, well, what do I think? Like, what do I think I should do, setting all of these limitations aside? And the answer was clear: send the email. So I clicked send on it, and that email ended up catalyzing a series of events that led to me. I mean, if I hadn't sent that email, I wouldn't have gotten an interview to work on this Mars mission. It led to me working on the operations team for that Mars exploration rovers mission, which then led to me writing my first best-selling book, Think Like a Rocket Scientist. So you and I wouldn't be chatting right now if that 17-year-old boy hadn't clicked send on that email. And so I think regardless of where you are in life, you probably have a story like that, where you thought to yourself, or someone else told you can't do that, and you did it anyway, and something amazing resulted from that. And so I encourage you to take a moment to go on an inner journey, to reflect, find that story in your life. And when you find yourself filled with doubt about your capabilities, filled with doubt about what you're able to achieve, anchor back in that story and click send.
Thank you. Again, that story is in this book, Awaken Your Genius, and then you can find it in the link down below. And then there is actually also an interesting addition to the story that Ozan just said. I think you mentioned, you talked about, you actually went through this thought process. See, what's the worst that can happen?
Mm-hmm.
And then the worst can happen is that I said no. Okay, there's no opportunity. Well, that's not end of the world, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and what's the worst that can happen is that he won't respond to my email. And there are some cases where the worst that can happen is more significant than that. And so I want to acknowledge that too. And so then there is a lot of value to actually sitting down and thinking about what you might do. So what might you do? And I engaged in this exercise myself when I was leaving academia. Because once you leave your professor job, you can't really get it back. Once you leave tenure, it's really hard to get it back. And so this was a point of no return. I was crossing the Rubicon, and I really wanted to make sure that I had a plan B in place. And that's why I didn't quit right away, right? I mentioned I placed these little bets while I was still a professor to see what would happen. And it was only after my first book, Think Like a Rocket Scientist, was published and it did well, and the speaking opportunities began to come, that I felt more comfortable leaving and taking that irreversible decision of leaving academia.
Yeah, I think that's a great point too, because I think sometimes when people think about following your curiosity or following the path that's less traveled, it feels like, okay, I'm taking a huge risk of stepping into the unknown. I'm going to leave everything behind and jump down the cliff. But actually, that's not how it happened.
Yeah.
I think that's what in Ozan's first book, which again is also translated to Chinese, 叫做像火箭科学家一样思考, think like a rocket scientist. Basically talking about if you get a moonshot, it's not like, oh, tomorrow I'm going to the moon. There's a lot of planning.
Mm-hmm.
It's very down to earth, very detailed. So share with us a bit about that, because I think that's why it's not just saying, okay, this is about being brave, just go step out. Yes, that's a starting point. But after you cross that bridge, like psychologically, there's a lot of things you have to do with your hand, with your feet, and then to catch up or to build the road yourself. How do you do planning like that? How do you think, what's your mental process of thinking about, crossing that bridge? Just like, I think the example you mentioned already, but like, what's the general framework you use to plan for these changes?
Yeah, I call that backcasting in Think Like a Rocket Scientist. So when we think about the future, we normally do forecasting. This is what businesses do, and what most businesses do is they look at what they did last year and then they copy and paste with some little modification. So they look at, last year's revenue, last year's customer base, last year's market, and then they take those numbers and try to figure out what this year or next year is going to look like. And I think forecasting is a fine exercise, but it comes with a significant problem. And the problem is that it begins with the status quo. So it takes all of our problematic biases and assumptions embedded into the status quo and just projects them out into the future. So what we did yesterday ends up restricting our vision for what we could do tomorrow. Backcasting flips the script. Backcasting says, I don't care about my present reality. I don't care about what we did last year. Instead of beginning with the status quo, I'm going to begin with an ideal future, ideal reality in the future, and then work backward from the future to determine how that future can be attained. And I already gave an example of this when I was in middle school. And I wasn't calling it backcasting at the time, of course, but that's essentially what I was doing. I began with this audacious moonshot of becoming an astronaut one day, and then I worked backward from it to determine exactly what I had to do to make that a reality. So that's why I researched the background of all of these NASA astronauts, and I created this roadmap for myself to follow, learning English, getting into a college here, doing really well, studying astrophysics and that sort of thing. And so that became my roadmap for making that moonshot a reality. But if I was just asking myself, as a middle schooler in Turkey, what can I do given what I have? I probably would never have left Turkey. And so it was that mentality of dreaming big, but also combining that idealism with pragmatism. So with like creating a really concrete roadmap for making that dream a reality is the key one of the keys that I talk about in that book. And note, by the way, I didn't get my moonshot. I never got to be an astronaut, at least not yet. We'll see. We'll see what happens with like private space travel. But I got to work on one of the most successful interplanetary missions of all time. And if I wasn't aiming high, and if I hadn't combined that moonshots through backcasting with creating a really concrete roadmap for making that moonshot a reality, I never would have done the things that landed me a seat on the operations team for that Mars mission.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for sharing that. I think I like that word too, backcasting. I think there are two layers of meaning. One is start with your vision or start with your goal, where you want to be. Don't start with where you are. Because if you start where you are, all you see is limitations. And that applies to everyone. Start where you want to. And the second, the casting part is also important. It's like, how do you then build from that goal, have a roadmap? How do I come from A to B? And I think the third part you're saying is beautiful is that sometimes you probably don't get to B. You get to B1. But B1 probably is as good. It opens the door to C2.
Yeah, exactly. And B2 and C2 end up being far better than where you would have ended up if you weren't aiming high, right? And so that failure, it's a failure if you see it that way, right? You didn't get your moonshot, you failed, but you failed above where you otherwise would have ended up. And to me, that's an amazing success.
Yeah, absolutely. No, because you mentioned that it's similar to me, like you said, I couldn't have met you if I didn't start writing my first book too. Because I think when I started writing, this is my first book ever, I was very nervous. And then it was launched during the pandemic. And it's like, well, there's no bookshop tours you can do and nothing, which I think similar to your book is also launched during COVID. And then so I ended up starting a video channel, talk about the book. And then in order to promote my book, I have to talk to different people. And I end up knowing so many interesting people. It's like, I never have thought that I could meet some of the authors, like including yourself. But then because then I started, then the channel has subscribers and then the publisher started to go after me saying, hey, can you talk to our author? And then I got even just this year alone, I talked to 6 different people that, are best-selling authors, which isn't, I never planned a career like that way. But when you are open-minded, when you're shooting high, because my goal, as you said, is I just want my book to reach more people. That's all. But when you're shooting that way, you end up opening so many doors. That's almost serendipity in life. I think that's what you actually talked about, called the outer journey, right? So when you the part 3 is inner journey in this book, and then go to the outer journey. Of course, it's like when you do the inner work, you somehow see a very different external world, and then it's your interaction with it are also different. Yeah, can you talk a little bit about the outer journey? What do you mean by that?
For sure, yeah. So let's just continue with this backcasting theme, right? So you did the inner journey, you sort of figured out where you want to be, you created this plan for yourself. I think once you start walking the path, once you start going on this outer journey of actually exploring the world, there's so much, and there's a number of ideas I talk about there, but I'll just continue with that thread. There's so much value in being open-minded. I think part of what, even with backcasting, you create this plan, but don't be limited by the plan. Because once you start walking down the path, life is going to give you other possibilities that you couldn't see when you were in the planning stage, right? Like same thing with you, for example, you launched a book during the pandemic, and the traditional way of promoting it was no longer available. You may have said, well, I'm going to try to make it work anyway, or sort of look for other traditional possibilities. Instead, you decided to create this online channel. And so that's what I'm talking about when I mentioned being open-minded, is the plan that you created 2 years ago might say, go do X. But now you have more information. Now you have better information because you actually have been walking down the path. And so there's a lot of value in listening to that and honoring what you're feeling and what you're seeing right now, versus saying, well, I made this plan 2 years ago and I have to stick to it, because then you become blinded to other possibilities. And that certainly happened to me during the pandemic as well. I planned this, traditional book tour, and everything had to get canceled. And I had to start over from scratch and ask myself, well, how do I get the word out about my book in a world where there are no book tours and the physical bookstores are all closed? And so, and I ended up, partnering with other authors who had books released around the same time as well, and doing virtual events like this one to get the word out about our books. And honestly, I think those virtual events ended up being far more successful than a traditional book tour ever would have been. And then I thought to myself, wow, that was a mistake. I realized in hindsight that a traditional book tour is, I'm in Portland, Oregon right now. I fly to New York City. I talk at a Barnes and Noble for maybe 100 people at most, and then I sign some books and come home, and that's like a 2-day commitment for me. It's so much easier to do this online now, and I realized, if I was being honest with myself, like, why did I decide to do a book tour in the first place? The answer was, well, because everyone else does it that way. It was like, well, that's what authors do. You write a book and then you go on a book tour. You write a book and then you go on a book tour. And I hadn't done the inner work of asking myself, well, wait a minute, is this the right path for me? Is this really the most effective way to get the word out about my book? And it was only because of the pandemic that I ended up looking for other possibilities. So much value to being open-minded and doing both the inner work of asking, is this the right path for me? But also being open-minded as you get information from the external world about what's working and what's not working, and being willing to change your plans or even sometimes abandon them based on what you're seeing.
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes limits becomes a source of innovation. That's usually how it works. Yeah. And then, so like when I guess that I really enjoy your way of thinking. So I guess that apply everywhere. So like when something happens, instead of immediately say this is a bad thing or this is a limit, if we view it as neutral, right? So I think that's what sort of the Buddhism wisdom saying as well. There's no bad or good. This is something we assigned. This is something happened. And then how do you take advantage of that? Doesn't matter if it's good or bad by your definition. And that's what you're doing. I think that's it reminded me the same thing, because I have, in the pandemic, I'm basically single parenting 3 kids because my husband is running the school. And so I started doing workshops, for career workshops. Usually you have to do retreats, like you go to a hotel for 3 days and people go there and do that. I was like, I can't do that. There's no way I can get away. I have to take care of my kids. So I designed this thing called, instead of 3 days offline, we do 6 weeks online. And I do it on my time. And it actually worked beautifully and people like it. It's a longer experience. It's very similar, as you said. I said, well, why do I have to go to a hotel and sit there? And everybody to travel and buy your plane tickets to get all these delays and all that. Like, why didn't I think about this earlier? But I guess that's where, when we think about limits or limits, quote unquote, with a different lens, like you will realize you have like unlimited ability to innovate or do things around things, right? So I think that's what your book is about as well. Okay, so now it gets to my last two last questions. The first one is actually going back to a little bit of your root and who influenced you. You talk a lot of times about your dad in previous interviews. You mentioned him as well. Like if you do a very honest reflection of your own journey growing up, what do you think set you apart? Like not set you apart academically and all that, like all those thinking, this framework, or this underlining, like when you start backcasting in middle school, right? Like, I mean, I guess the cliche question is who in your family influenced you the most, but I want to be a bit more open. Like if you look at your own journey growing up, what are the things that impacted you? I think because most of my audience are parents. They have kids. I'm sure they're wondering, how do I become a good parent? Like, how do I create an environment in the conformist society with limited resources to raise somebody like Ozan? Any pointers?
Yeah, the person growing up who influenced me the most was actually my grandfather. And Awaken Your Genius and the dedication, he is listed first for that reason. I spent my summers, so they lived in this little town 2 hours outside of Istanbul. So I spent my summers with them, and he fostered this sense of curiosity in me about everything. And the way he did that wasn't to say, oh, let's go do this or let's go do that. He just sort of followed me. So he had this garden, and I was really interested in like cherries and different trees and different plants he had. I remember this was one of my very first memories. Maybe I was like 3 or 4 years old. I remember just walking the garden with him, and all he did was when I said, "Oh, I'm curious about this. Let's go like touch this to see what this feels like." He would lean in. He would just say, "Oh yeah, let's go do that. That's really interesting. Like, tell me more. What are you seeing?" And he would engage in this. I would be the leader of curiosity, and he would simply follow me, make sure I was safe. But he did this in a very playful, lighthearted way, and that's something I've carried with me my whole life. Is like I have that image in my head a lot of like me exploring the garden of life with my grandfather watching over me. And embodying that playful safety that he fostered. Again, not telling me I should do something, not telling me you should be curious about this, or you're gonna make money if you go to this profession. None of that. He just leaned in and followed my lead, encouraged my curiosity, and that sense really remained with me. And then the second part, I think, regardless of all of these voices I mentioned that I was hearing, these limiting beliefs about what I can or can't achieve, given the fact that I was born in Turkey to limited economic conditions, I had parents who never said, "You can't do that." They just always said, when I told them I wanted to be an astronaut in middle school, I think another set of parents may have told me, "You can't do that." Maybe in another life, but like not in this one. You're setting yourself up for disappointment. You're going to be sad when you fail. That wasn't the mindset they adopted. I think both of them would repeatedly say, "Hey, if you work hard, if you commit yourself, you can do anything." And that was the belief that I embodied, and that was the belief that really propelled me to click send on that email, for example, even with those voices of doubt filling in my head. So that I think the combination of those two mindsets of shoot your moonshot, and even if you don't get it, you're going to fail above where you would have ended up, and that sense of playful curiosity really served me well in my life, and I still think about those two mindsets to this day.
Yeah, wow, what a beautiful picture with your grandpa following you when you were exploring the garden. And the two words you mentioned called playful safety, I think both are critical. I think playful, as you say, is like, is creating this sense of permission.
Yeah.
That everything you do, every question, there's no stupid questions, there's no like a thought or dream too big. But that safety part is basically, well, if something fails, I'm here.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
If you hurt yourself, well, it's okay. I'm going to, put a Band-Aid on you.
Right. And I think that's really important too, because there's a way of fostering safety that's actually suffocating. So if you try to foster safety by saying, "I'm going to confine you, I'm not going to let you explore the world, I'm not going to let you disappoint yourself," right? I don't want you to be sad. So I don't want you to aim high. I'm going to keep you safe from fears and from sadness and from grief and from disappointment. I think that's not the type of safety that I'm talking about here.
Yeah.
The type of safety he fostered was, no, you're going to experience all of that. You are going to fall down.
Yeah.
You are going to fail. You are going to make mistakes. Not every path you follow is going to be a good one, but I'm here watching over you. And when you fall, as you said, you'll cry, and then we'll put a Band-Aid on it, and you'll be fine. And that way of letting me explore, but also providing that safety in the background, that was crucial.
Yeah. Well, exactly. I think that's probably the balance where I like how you talked about safety in that way, because in Chinese it's the same. People think about safety as, okay, I'm protecting from any potential harm. Like,
yeah,
being in this greenhouse, right? So like then it's getting, and then everything's warm. Don't go out. That's not safety. That's actually depriving them their ability to explore the world. It's called deprivation. Sometimes we have this wrong concept that we think this depriving you of opportunities is also protecting you from risks.
Right.
You ended up actually shutting down their most inner drive for life. Yeah. Beautifully said. And then, yeah, well, I hope your grandfather great health.
He passed away sadly about 10 years ago, but I can still feel him, and I know that, and it's that sense of playful safety he fostered is still lives. So
Yeah,
yeah,
lives in you.
yeah, exactly.
Thank you. And the last question I have is, I'm curious, I'm sure our audience are too, is what journey are you on now? So the book is done, and the book is done.
Yes.
I think people would read it, and then again, everybody should read this book. And then if you can have the English version, of course, you can buy it in the States, but the Chinese version is available. It's beautifully translated. 大家可以在购物间看到。But the reason I asked this question is that because I wrote books myself, because I think I know, of course, it's a reflection of our life, but it's also a project. You know, you have to work on it. There's many people you work with. There's a launch and all that. So I'm really curious as an author yourself, and which write about life itself, and life changes every day. Yeah, what's new since the book? What journey are you on now?
I think the journey I went on this past summer is really worth sharing. So the book came out in English in April. And normally the way I operate is I finish one thing and then I immediately start the next thing. There is no break in between. And that's what I did with Think Like a Rocket Scientist. Like the week after that book came out, I started writing the proposal for what ended up being Awaken Your Genius. And for the first time in my life, I did not do that. So I went on this journey this past summer after the publicity was over with the book to resist the pull toward the next big thing. And instead of immediately starting the next thing, I actually gave myself permission to not do anything. And this was a moonshot for me, honestly, because it's just so different from the way that I normally operate, which is moving from one thing to the next. Is this summer, I just stepped into the void. And instead of immediately moving into execution, I started collecting ideas like a tree absorbing water so I can bear fruit later on. And, you know, and a lot of my thinking now is influenced by nature too. You know, if you look at nature, trees don't try to produce fruit year round in an absurd attempt to be more productive, right? They have their seasons. They produce fruit during one season, but then they're dormant the next. And so channeling them and modeling them, I just sat dormant this summer. All I did, you know, I gave a few keynotes, but aside from that, I was just collecting ideas. And all of these ideas were coming through. Instead of jumping on them, I just collected them. I just sat in the void and see what signals were coming through. And I have to say, it was one of the most difficult things I've ever done, is to just let myself be in that space versus immediately moving into execution. But as the fall started, you know, like after that 3-month, 4-month period ended, I had this sense of, wow, I have now so many ideas and I'm more clear-headed. I'm not just jumping onto the next thing because it's the next thing. I can actually do a much healthier, much clear-headed evaluation of what's the right next move or set of moves for me, based on what came through this summer. And so I think I'll now adopt that going forward, is have those periods of reflection and downtime. And then, you know, in some seasons there'll be time to think. In other seasons there'll be time to execute. And so I think as we moved on to the fall and the winter, I moved into execution mode and started working on the proposal for my next book, and I have a number of other projects in the works. But yeah, that was an important learning for me from this past year, was learning my own seasons and actually honoring them.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, because it seems to be easy for us to do things because you get occupied.
Yeah.
And, right. We have a sense of security somehow when we're occupied. Our calendar is full, right? So there's a timeline. But doing nothing is the deepest sense of doing, meaning you are allowing the world to work through you.
Yeah.
You're letting go your inner blockages or inner structure, so to speak, right? And the structure is a positive word and blockage seem to be the negative, but it's the same thing. There's some inner thing there that kind of stop the life to flow or shape the life that flows you in certain way. But when you let go that structure, then it shows probably in the most extraordinary way, which we were not often not ready to take. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's hard, as you said, because it feel like, because again, in our social concepts, it feels like I'm just being lazy and non-productive. Right.
Yeah, and I'm sure a lot of people listening to this were like chastised by their parents or teachers for daydreaming, right? For like letting their mind drift. And daydreaming is one of the most productive things you can do. And I think when you let your mind drift, it seems like there's nothing happening, but appearances deceive. Your subconscious is hard at work and this is, by the way, why if you ask people, where do you get your best ideas? Most people will say the shower, right? Because it's like one of the few periods in your day where you're free from distractions and notifications, and it's just you and your thoughts, and all of these ideas begin to bubble up to the surface because you're giving your subconscious room to connect dots, to make new associations. And ideas don't come with a loud bang. Like there is no parade. The big idea never screams that it's a big idea. At first glance, the big thing looks actually quite small.
Yeah.
But if there is no void in your life, if you're constantly moving from one notification to the next, one email to the next, one meeting to the next, you won't be present to hear that subtle whisper when it arrives. And so there's so much value in undoing or unbeing and letting yourself sit, replicating those shower-like conditions throughout the day, going for a walk with no podcast, no audiobook, just you and your thoughts. There's so many examples of scientists literally walking themselves into the right answer. Like they'll be stuck on some problem, they'll go for a walk, and then the answer will arrive as if by magic. And yeah, so much value in taking your foot off the gas pedal, and you'll find that can actually be the best way to accelerate.
Yeah, thank you. Well, then we're looking forward to your new book then. when the next season comes.
Yes, exactly.
Where you have to soak up the water and then the nutrients, and now it can form some of new fruits. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much again for the time. I'm sure just like myself, our audience have enjoyed this conversation. Again, I'll say this in Chinese. 大家可以看到他的这本书的中文版，在我们的购物间可以看到啊，是非常新的书。然后也特别感谢我们出版社引进这本书，Awaken Your Genius， 因为其实它的一个核心的概念就是我们每个人都有 genius 啊，每个人都有，所以其实是怎么样把它叫醒的这么一个过程。然后里面有他自己的故事，也有很多方法。So I was just saying, like it's not only about your own story, but also it's about a lot of approach or methods like everybody can learn and use in Awaken Your Genius. Because I like this book title because it means it's not you have to find your genius, you have to go purchase your genius, right? Or acquire your genius. It's already there. You need to awaken it. And this is also very similar to lots of the Buddhism wisdoms as well, because I think it was talking about, I think everybody has three treasures. They were saying one is your awareness, and one is your love and compassion, and third is your wisdom. We actually all sitting on them, but oftentimes we kind of ignore them. We're looking at, okay, what kind of shed I'm sitting in. It seems like the shed is your only is your only property, but that's not true. Those are like the gems hidden below you. Is what everybody have. Sorry, that's the noise of my kids in the background. But but I think this book actually basically is founded. I really like it because I think it's very much on the same principle. Like everybody has that, but you do need some reminders. Sometimes I call it reminders to say, hey, first of all, you have it. It's here. It's here. And second, hey, those are 5 tools you can use to open up and see your gem and have your genius shine through. And so this book have both. It's both a reminder, and of course, it's also a beautiful story. Beautiful stories. There are many stories. It's a reminder. It's a lot of stories, and it's a lot of tools, and you can use to awaken our own genius. So really, thank you for putting this, making this available for whoever read the book. I think it's a blessing for whoever receive the book and reads it as a pathway to awaken our own genius. All right. Thank you again, Ozan. And any last words for our audience before I let you go?
No, I just want to say thank you so much, Inuo, for having me on the show and your kind words about the book. I really appreciated the opportunity to chat with you. And yeah, looking forward to our next conversation.